Now that we've learned how to create our horizontal geometry, let's take a look at some of the tools that are available to edit our geometric elements. Now, some of the editing tools are available in the Geometry ribbon tab, so they can be found here under the Modify section. You can also find some of the modification tools over here under Common Tools, and then also under the Drawing ribbon tab in the Modify section. So we're not going to have time to cover all of these tools, but as we go through the exercise, we will use some of these tools for modifying our geometric elements. Now before we begin editing our geometry, it's important to understand the rules and relationships that are associated with the geometry and the overall design intent. So to illustrate that, I want to select the alignment. Let's take a look at some of the dynamic text and the various manipulators and handlers that are attached to the geometry. So I'm going to come over here and we're going to select the alignment. And notice we have various manipulators and dynamic text and snap icons attached to the geometry. Now all of this is an indication of the rules and relationships that are associated with the geometry and the design intent. Okay, so let's go make some changes just so you can understand how using the various tools and using the various snaps and things of that nature play a role in how the geometry will behave when you start making changes. So the first thing I want to take a look at are the differences in the manipulators on each of the three curves that we've created. So I'm going to zoom over here to the upper portion of our alignment, and let's take a look at the first curve and the third curve. Both of those curves were created using Place Simple Arc, and we just selected two tangent lines and a radius, and we keyed in a radius. Okay, so the manipulators available for editing on this particular curve are the radius and then the PI. Okay, so if we want to change the radius on this particular curve, all we have to do is key in a radius. So let's change this to 1,000, for example. Okay, and the radius changes. If you want to modify the PI, you can select one of the graphical handlers here and just grab it and you can slide it around. Okay, so this technique applies to the first curve and the third curve because we use Place Simple Arc. Now if we move to the second curve here, if you recall, we placed that second curve using the Place Simple Arc from element, and we used a specific length as well as a radius. Now one thing to point out about this particular curve is notice the manipulators are slightly different. We still have the radius, so we can adjust the radius dynamic text. We can adjust the arc length, which we didn't have when we used Place Simple Curve, and we can also adjust the delta angle. So because we used a different command, we're getting a whole different set of rules here for what we can actually edit on this particular curve. So let's make a simple change. Okay, so let's change this radius to 1,000 as well. So I'm going to key in 1,000 here. And notice it changes the curve quite significantly. It also holds the curve length as well, but it adjusts the outgoing bearing. Now the reason it held the curve length was because we just made a change to the radius, and the original tool we used, we told it to use an arc length of 1550. So it's important to understand that, depending on which tool you used, the geometry will adjust and behave differently. Okay, now let's take a look at making some other changes. Let's change the arc length this time. Let's change this to 500. When we change it to 500, it's going to hold the radius as well as hold the arc length, but it's going to adjust the outgoing bearing because the only way to maintain this arc length is to adjust the curve's exit bearing. Okay, so it's important to remember those things when you're creating geometry. One other thing I'd like to point out is the different dynamic text colors that you see along the alignment. So you're going to notice that some of the dynamic text appears gray, and that just indicates that it cannot be edited directly in the view. So the only way we can edit that is to get to the underlying base geometry or the base elements. Okay, so to get to the underlying geometry, the underlying base elements, to make a change to the direction and distance would be to select the alignment and do a right click. And then when you do a right click, that gets you down to the base element. So in this particular case, we're going down to the base element, which is our first tangent line that we created. And if we want to change that bearing or that distance, then we can simply, again, select on the distance or the bearing. And in this case, I'm just going to do a simple change. I'm going to change this bearing to north 70 degrees, 0 minutes, 0 seconds east. And then when we do that, you can see how the alignment will adjust accordingly. And then when you're done, just do a data point or left click to complete. So as you can see there, it's pretty easy to make changes to the geometry, but you also need to pay attention to the rules and the relationships that exist between the different geometric elements. So I'm just going to do an undo here a couple times just to get me back to where we began, and then we will continue on.